Let's give a traditionally warm welcome to Chip Colwell.
Thank you very much. Good morning. All right, that's great. This is a really enthusiastic crowd. I'm usually used to scientists who just kind of sit there, and maybe they'll glance to the person next to them, but that's about it. And so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of 48 Native American tribes who now live across the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and the American Southwest. So traditions. It's the holiday season, and when I thought to myself, what is a warm, fuzzy topic that we could take on? I thought of burying our dead. I'm an archaeologist, and I've thought a whole lot, actually, about this issue over the last few years, and we'll talk about some of the work I've done. But I think why I thought this might be actually a really appropriate topic for you is that death, as we'll think more about, is a human universal. It is something that we all are facing in one way or another. And yet how we approach it, how we conceive of it, how we feel about it, how we deal with it, is all attuned to our individual creativity and the creativity of the societies in which we live. In 2013, two spelunkers headed out to a cave called Rising Star Cave, about 30 miles outside of Johannesburg in South Africa. It's a cave that was already widely known, but not fully explored. And the two spelunkers, here's one of them, entered the cave, and they went back to this corner. No one, it's my understanding, had ever really been through this tight little space. It's less than 10 inches. But the two of them forced their bodies through it, and then they found this much larger chamber. And then these two adventurers weren't done, so they kept going, and they climbed up this huge boulder about 3 stories high, and they found yet another tiny, minuscule chute that they then dropped down into. And when they went into this chamber, it's about 30 feet long, not even 9 feet wide. They found thousands of bones just sitting there on the surface. They actually had already been in conversations with some anthropologists and paleontologists. The paleontologist said, yeah, you're in caves, keep your eye out for anything important. So they reached out to these archaeologists and anthropologists, and they started digging. And what they found was a brand new species on our human lineage that they named Homo naledi. We now know that Homo naledi lived about 250,000 years ago. And it was an incredibly exciting discovery because finding a new branch of our evolutionary tree is huge news. It's very hard to do, very rare. But what was perhaps just as exciting with this discovery was the implication of where they found these bones. The archaeologists determined that there were probably about 15 individuals, all in this one chamber. And geologists came out and they discovered that this chamber had been in this stable geologic state for about 1 million to 2 million years. There was never any kind of opening. These boulders hadn't shifted. Nothing had moved in the 250,000 years since those Homo naledi ancestors of ours were first put in that chamber. So what does that mean? It means that it seems quite possible that this is the world's first known burial site. Some archaeologists are skeptical of this claim. No one thinks that they weren't put there intentionally, but the question is why? Why were they put there intentionally? Did it have something to do with religious beliefs, an understanding of an afterlife? Or there was a whole range of other possibilities. Maybe they were simply perceived as diseased or they had some problem. So they were put in this place far away. But a lot of archaeologists do think that this could be the first burial. But these questions of the first burial, in fact, have always been controversial. This is a cave in Iran, where there are the remains of a Neanderthal, another of our ancestral cousins. And there's a Neanderthal that was found here, buried under the ground. And archaeologists found within the burial were all kinds of wildflowers. The suggestion at the time, and although still controversial, is that perhaps when this Neanderthal was buried there 60,000 years ago, that they were actually buried with flowers, suggesting even more, not just the importance of burial, very, very deep in time, but sort of the act of mourning, and that perhaps flowers, this tradition of offering something to the ancestors, is very, very deep in our human being. So why do we bury the dead? Well, treating the dead matters because we, as a species, have decided it matters. There's nothing requiring us to do it. And yet, even as we all do it, we all treat the dead. Every single known human society has treated the dead in some particular way. The way we do it has changed and varies across culture and time. So what are some of these traditions? Well, let's start with our own. In the West, many of us will bury the dead. Where did this begin? Well, starting about 1,000 years ago, churches became the places for burials. And largely the idea was that those who had died needed the prayers of the living to be cared for in death, and especially those who might have died without the last rites. And so the dead were placed in front of the churchyard where their souls would be cared for and where parishioners and those going to the church would remember to pray for those who'd passed. Those early graveyards were very chaotic. Archaeologically, we find, for example, that often as one body was being placed into the ground, it would actually intrude into a previous burial because they didn't have any way of marking it or knowing people were there. So you find these just jigsaw puzzles of humans and their remains in these churchyards. This began to change in the 1800s when Napoleon helped establish Père Lachaise in Paris, which is kind of the kind of cemetery we're most familiar with today, where essentially this is a space often separate from a church. It's dedicated to the individual. And this very much came about because of Protestant beliefs that the soul didn't need to be cared for by the living, but rather it was in the care of God. Cremations are also a worldwide phenomenon. Archaeologically, we find these happening about 5,000 years ago, starting in the Near East and then Europe. And then it became a custom that we see throughout the Western world for a very long time. But it's not just limited to the Western world. In fact, I got my start doing archaeology in Arizona. And there's an ancient culture that archaeologists call the Hohokam. They lived about 1,000 years ago in central and southern Arizona. And many of the Hohokam cremated their dead. So that's just one example of how many cultures throughout many times and places cremated their dead. And it did fall out of favor in the Western world as burials in churches picked up 1,000 years ago. But with the creation of the modern crematorium that was very efficient and relatively easy to use, cremations really began to come back in favor in the 1870s in the United States and elsewhere in Europe. And so these are, though, just the traditions that I've highlighted so far, really about the Western world. And I'm going to share with you just a few examples of just the amazing creative ideas and practices that people all across the world have come up with. So we can begin in the Philippines. And the Philippines have an indigenous community called the Tiguan. And they mummify their ancestors. And then they care for their ancestors amongst them as if they were living. So they'll feed them, give them a bed to sleep in. They care for them. They truly believe that their ancestors are still amongst them, even in death. Another really fascinating tradition is the Cavateño, also in the Philippines. This is a massive tree with basically crevices that are carved out of the tree. And before one dies, you actually pick the tree in which you'll be buried in. And then you're placed in this tree. And so that literally the tree is a living entity that surrounds you and embodies you. And it becomes a kind of literal family tree. These kinds of tree burials we also see here in North America. Many Plains Indian groups practiced tree burials. The plains not having many topographic features, trees were seen as a way of connecting one to the heavens. And so bodies were placed in scaffolding up in trees. Tibetan Buddhists believe that the human body is merely a vessel, that it has no function beyond carrying our consciousness. And so they believe that when they die, it's an act of charity to give your body to carrion, to birds, mostly vultures, that then consume the body as sort of one person's final act of charity. A very similar practice, but for very different reasons, are the Zoroastrians. And the Zoroastrians have large towers called a Tower of Silence. And their idea is essentially that the body is an unclean thing. And when it dies, it can immediately begin to pollute the world. And so in order for the body not to pollute the world, it needs to be disposed of as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And so they create these large stone towers in which their ancestors are placed, and then mostly vultures will come and consume those remains, allowing the earth to remain pure. In Madagascar, there is a tradition called turning of the bones that takes place every 7 years, where one's relatives are excavated from their graves, and they are danced and paraded throughout villages. And the idea is that it's a revisiting of the ancestors, that the ancestors are never really lost to us, but they have the ability to continue to be amongst us. Here closer to home, there's also a whole range of different kinds of practices around how we mourn the dead. There's, for example, the jazz burials of New Orleans, where rather than a somber ceremony, this is a ceremony of life, of renewal, of celebration. And so there's dancing and singing throughout the streets. Perhaps, though, the world's most dynamically artistic tradition is, it takes place in Ghana, where one's coffin is carved into a sculpture, which is an emblem of one's life. So, for example, if you were a mechanic, you might have a wrench for a coffin. If you distributed Coca-Cola, or maybe just really loved it, you will have a Coca-Cola coffin. Cacao pods, what chocolate is made out of, is a very popular choice because of cacao farming in West Africa. South Koreans have recently created a technology that allows cremated remains to be turned into gemstones, and so that one's ancestors can literally become gems. Another version of this allows cremated remains to become embedded in coral reefs, so that your life in the afterlife can be spent underwater. And so what happens, given the importance of burials to peoples everywhere around the world? What happens when we can't bury the dead? Societies have come up in other ways of trying to deal with this as well. We have, for example, the Tomb of the Unknown, right, which is a place to symbolize the sense of we need somewhere where families and others can go to grieve, to give their sense of loss, even if the remains of their loved one are gone. Back when I first started here at the museum in 2007, I got involved with several museums who lost their loved ones in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. Not many people know that, but more than 1,000 people who perished in the World Trade Center, their remains were never found. And so there are many families that have no way of fulfilling what they say is their sense of obligation of burying their loved ones. And I worked with families because the 9/11 museum there at Ground Zero has actually taken control of unidentified remains that were recovered at the scene. And many families didn't want these remains in museums, but rather they wanted them in a memorial. Here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, we've also had to deal with these issues, but predominantly with the Native American community. In the United States today, there's still more than 100,000 Native American skeletons that are in museums. Many of these, if not most of them, were taken without the consent or permission of Native Americans. And so for the last several years, I've been researching, and then I've just published a book that really tells this story about how do museums deal with these claims from Native communities. On the one hand, many Native American human remains can give us insights into history in the past. On the other hand, many Native Americans are demanding the return of their ancestors to restore their ancestral rights and their sense of dignity as human beings. So in conclusion, I want to point out that burying our ancestors is perhaps one of our earliest traditions as human beings. And it is so deep, it even goes beyond the human experience. It goes to our non-human ancestors. I would say that the fact that humans live with the dead is one of the things that bring us from the realm of the natural world, that bring us from mere animals into the realm of culture. It makes us who we are. It's the deepest expression of our humanity. And I would say that caring for those who've passed is a way of keeping them amongst us. And I think we saw this, for example, in the Philippines. Whether your ancestor is living in a tree or your ancestor is buried somewhere special to you, it's a way to remember them and to keep them amongst us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chip. That was awesome.